Hi there, I'm Pastor Clark from St. Paul Lutheran Church in Clinton, Iowa, and we get to do some Bible study again today. We are picking up kind of where we left off. Jesus got into a boat, the crowds were so big, and he began to teach them in parables. Last week it was the parable of the sower and the seed, and the focus on the good soil that produced abundantly. And here we come up with another set of parables, and in the way that the lectionary chops it up, what we'll actually hear on Sunday takes out the parables in the middle, and skips from the parable of the weeds and the wheat to all the way past the other parables into Jesus's explanation of it. So let's call this parable, instead of the parable of the weeds and the wheats, the parable of the non-controlling God. Think of controlling behavior in terms of not just a control freak, but somebody who's everything's got to be so, and there's no room for difference or deviation from that, sort of a my way or the highway kind of attitude. That's not the God we encounter in this parable. So here it is, the parable of the non-controlling God. So Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven can be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. So right off the bat, Jesus is trying to give his people and us a vision of the kingdom. That's what this story is all about, a vision of what the kingdom of heaven is like. Again, like the parable we heard last week, the seed is good, sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. Now, enemy, that's an important word for the Gospel of Matthew, mostly because Jesus is very clear about an invitation to love our enemies. The Sermon on the Mount is where Jesus describes that first, loving enemies. And in other places, others that we've heard in recent weeks and months, Jesus talks about one's own enemies will be members of their own family. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword, to set father against son and son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother. And so when we hear the word enemy and this whole parable, it fits within this larger conversation that is not, it's not either or. It's not black or white. It's complicated. And complicated most of all by love. Love is the complication, right? Love your enemies. That complicates the simple way we want to divide the world into us versus them, winners and losers, the people on the right side of history and the people on the wrong side of history. There's lots of ways to talk about it, but when we hear the word enemy, think about love, think about that complication. And we're going to see a complicated response to this problem of weeds being sown among the wheat. Okay? Yeah, so when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. So it takes some time before the problem is revealed. The problem is not immediately apparent. Then the slaves of the householder came and said to him, "Master, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Then where did these weeds come from?" Now, this is maybe a very natural question. I mean, a question of where does evil come from? If God is a good God and God created the heavens and the earth and all creatures, where does evil come from? And a lot of people have answered that question and said, well, God is the problem. But there is a subtle defense of God in this parable. I'm getting ahead of myself, but maybe you can resonate with that question. Where did these weeds come from? But the owner, the owner of the field, the sower, well, then here's a first. I mean, this goes back to the beginning of the parable, but here is a sign that something's a little funny. Apparently, this landowner, who was wealthy enough to have slaves, sowed his own seed. Well, that's weird. So this is not your typical household. This is not your typical wealthy farmer. So then he replied, oh wait, nope, back up. He answered, verse 28 here. Where did these weeds come? Then he answered, an enemy has done this. There's a repetition of that word enemy. And there's an affirmation of the wisdom and the discernment of the sower. I don't know about you, but a lot of times I look at problems and I have no idea where the problem came from. How did it get this way? Where did the weeds come from? I don't know what went wrong. But the parable has already set us up to know that the sower didn't see what happened. The sower just looks at the results, looks at the produce, and knows. An enemy did this. Perhaps it's reflective of a trust in the work that the sower did, a trust in the seed, that this was good seed, a trust in the soil, that it's good soil. Perhaps that's where this wisdom comes from. But so that's something we know about this sower already in this response. No, an enemy did this. So the slave said to him, then do you want us to go and gather them? Let's fix the problem, they say. But then he replied, no, because in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat with them. Let them both grow until the harvest. This is a complicated problem with a complicated response. And, maybe I've talked about this before, maybe not in name. It's part of the learning and growing edge that I continue to be on, but it is about dualistic versus non-dualistic thinking, okay? Dualistic thinking is that black or white, either or. It leads to a kind of, there's a problem, fix it kind of mentality. That these workers demonstrate a kind of a knee-jerk response. But the sower, the one whose field this is, has a more patient response, a non-dualistic response. Both and. If either or is dualistic, then both and is non-dualistic, right? So dual meaning two, right? If we split the world into two. Non-dualistic is a refusal to split the world into two. It is to preserve the unity, the integrity. Why? Because of how destructive that will be, says the sower of the seed. So we already know that the sower of the seed is wise and discerning. Then the second thing we learn right here is that the sower is maybe we could say primarily or preeminently concerned about harm and not doing harm. to put it in a kind of, to borrow some language of war, this sower cares about collateral damage. Boy, this brings to mind in 2005, I was on internship. It was 2 years after the second war with Iraq, and an organization had done a study of how many Iraqi people have died. The United States took accounting of how many American soldiers were killed, but did no accounting of how many Iraqis died. And I forget who it was now. It might have been, I think it was published in The Lancet. Might have been a Johns Hopkins or something like that study of how many excess deaths, Iraqi deaths there were. So what was the collateral damage of the war against Iraq? What was that damage against Iraqis? And there was a dramatic number of, something like a 250,000 Iraqis died, not just as a result of direct, bombs and bullets, but also the fact that, when the United States attacked, it attacked infrastructure, knocked out power plants and water treatment facilities and all these kinds of things. So not being able to access health care, the disease that came as a result, the food shortages, all of these things. 250,000 Iraqis were estimated to have died. Again, I'm thinking back 15 years now, so feel free to check me on the details, but the broad strokes are accurate. And I remember presenting this in a Bible study. I'm in a group of Christians here, and people got up and walked out. They didn't want to hear it. This conversation about collateral damage and was this war worth it, because of the cost in human lives, our enemies, so-called enemies. Well, we tried to say it wasn't the Iraqi people, it was Saddam, but that's not how that's not the consequence. The outcome of the war was not just that Saddam was toppled. There was other collateral damage. So here's the wisdom, the same kind of nonviolent wisdom, which we have heard Jesus talk about in other places, especially in the Sermon on the Mount and the teaching to love one's enemies, that this violent response of uprooting the wheat, picking off the bad guys, so to speak, it causes too much damage. It harms the good seed, the wheat, as well. Okay, so what he says is, let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first, bind them into bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. So this is there's specific words in the Greek that indicate that this is not just maybe any old weeds, but a very specific weed that farmers in Jesus' time identified and pulled right away. And so it's very strange. Another mark of this being a strange farmer, that he would be willing to wait until the end, till everything has grown. There's this emphasis on growing together. Let them grow together. A way that Jesus and the gospel often talks about how we grow with God, how we grow with Jesus, how Jesus and us in a similar kind of way, our roots are tangled together. Boy, what if we trusted that our roots are tangled together with God's? Okay, so let me see. Okay, so right here, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Period. End of parable. But then we move in verse 31 into a new parable. There's, let me see. There's two more parables in the middle here. The mustard seed, we know this one. Small beginnings, great endings. And then the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman mixed in until it was leavened. Those are two more parables in the middle, and then a kind of a summary statement about why Jesus is speaking in parables. We heard this earlier, actually, or we could have. It was part of the way that the lectionary chopped out a middle piece where Jesus talked about why he talks in parables, which is, the disciples pull Jesus aside again. Jesus is talking to the crowds, and then there's a couple moments where the disciples pull Jesus aside and ask for an explanation. First of why are you talking in parables? Then what is this parable of the sower and the soil, the good soil? What's that all about? And then we have that kind of pattern repeated, where if we skip past this highlighted section and pick up at verse 36, where the lectionary is going to skip and pick up. Here we go again. Jesus left the crowds and went into the house, and the disciples approached him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." Now, this is kind of funny to me. It just feels so natural that after all this teaching and these parables in between, that the disciples would be like, whoa, slow down. Go back to the beginning. What was that first parable about? Perhaps it's saying that all the rest of those parables were lost on them because they were stuck back at the parable of the weeds and the wheat. So explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. Here's Jesus' answer. And maybe we could anticipate this, or perhaps we've heard this story enough times. We've just already internalized. So Jesus answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man." That's Jesus himself. That's what he's saying. I am the sower of the good seed. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. All right, so this is what we call an allegory, so that every character, and include a character including the weeds and the wheat and the field. Those are characters, so to speak, in the parable. All of those relate to something else very specific. That's an allegory. So Jesus says this parable is an allegory, and here's how all the different players in this parable are all of these things. Now, the enemy who sowed them is the devil. That's a reminder, takes us back to Jesus in the wilderness, the temptation by the devil. Again there, Jesus doesn't seek to destroy the devil. Jesus just merely resists the devil, refuses to become the devil. We might think also of Jesus' confrontation with Peter. Jesus has been saying how he's going to suffer, he's going to be killed. And after 3 days rise again, Peter says, "God forbid it. This must never happen to you." And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan, because you're putting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." This is the enemy. And maybe we can take those moments again as looking at the way Jesus responded in his own life to the cropping up of the enemy. The enemy was in Peter himself, the spokesman of the rest of the disciples. So then we can think back, connect the dots, so to speak, and see that the weeds and the wheat are growing together, even within Peter, even within Jesus' own disciples. We see that in Judas, right? where Jesus was willing until the very end. And then we can fast forward to when Jesus, after the resurrection, Jesus ascends into heaven. Jesus meets them on the mountain, and the disciples, they worship him and they doubt. Here again is the weeds and the wheat growing together in Jesus' own disciples and Jesus' willingness to let it be, to let it grow together. Boy, do we have that? Do we have that patience and that focus on what the cost of a violent response is? The cost of, it doesn't even have to be a violent response, just that knee-jerk, fix it, eliminate the problem, get rid of it, kind of a response. This is what Jesus tolerates within his own followers. And that's us, okay? That's us. So, just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire. So after naming, drawing the lines between this character is this character is that character, lining up all of the cast of characters, then Jesus unfolds the implications. So just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The end of the age, okay? So again, it's the end. This is talking about some patience, okay? The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers. And they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen. So the sorting and the separating will come. But it's not now. Now is not the time, is what Jesus is saying. I will take care of this, is what Jesus is saying. Lest we get up on our high horses and decide that we are going to be the solution to this problem. Jesus says, I will solve this problem. So here is this parable of our non-controlling God. Now, I often, I was recently trying a kind of a little meditation thing that was in a book that I was mentioning last week, that has you just relax your body, scan through your body, notice the tension or the warmth or the whatever it is that's in your body, and then focus on a problem, specifically a relationship problem, perhaps, but to focus on that problem and ask yourself a series of questions. And one of the questions it invites, maybe I have it here, maybe I have it marked. I can go ahead and get this exactly right. Yeah, give me just a second. I think it's worth getting this one right. Okay. Yeah, so one of the questions is, do I want to solve this problem? Let your feeling be the answer, not your words. Your words can deceive you. Then what are my intentions here? Am I trying to get approval? Am I trying to get control of myself or someone else? Ooh. That's a convicting question. And this parable is a convicting parable in that regard, of a God who is unwilling to be controlling, whose love is focused on not causing harm, but instead healing harm. A God who is focused on freedom, whose love is tasted in freedom and patience, in wisdom and discernment. I have to tell you, this parable actually, that impulse to control myself, which bleeds over into trying to control others. It's been a lifelong journey of letting go of that need to be in control, including of my own self. And this parable was transformational for me. I just really, literally, first of all, it changed my image of God. It shifted my image of God from this perfectionist who demanded perfection, and showed me God's patience and mercy and love, and then changed my own practice of like this violence against self, pursuit of a kind of a perfection or of a purity of eliminating problems, and opened myself up to this same kind, moving from that dualistic thinking, either or, to this both and kind of thinking. I have to say that in all truth, that is part of what this parable helped to bring into my life. Some letting go of visions of perfection, and that knee-jerk solve the problem, even when the problem's within myself. One of the questions in this, the next question after, am I trying to get control of myself or someone else's? Does it feel as if my survival is at stake? And what's amazing is even when Jesus' survival was at stake, he didn't become controlling. Even when, it could seem to this farmer, it could seem to a different farmer, as though his survival was at stake, his economic future, the outcome of his crop, the harvest, a fear that it's going to be ruined. That fear never becomes a dominant force for this farmer. But I think that question is there for a reason, because so often we feel as though our survival is at stake. Boy. And then, the last question out of this series of questions. What needs to be loved here? What needs to be loved here? That was the I didn't have access to this this book. I only had access to this parable. You actually don't need anything else but this parable, because the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of love and healing, is alive every time we read this parable. But instead of attacking the problem and the enemy, which I saw as myself and parts of myself back then, this parable and the transformation it worked invited me into love. What needs to be loved here? And the love of self, kind of connecting back to that previous parable, is to just trust the seed, trust the soil, trust the goodness. There's good seed and wheat growing among this harvest. And in our knee-jerk response, we're often not able to tell the difference. We're not able to see the difference between the weeds and the wheat. In fact, that's what some scholars say about this particular kind of weed is one that looks a lot like wheat, especially in the early days. We don't know who the good ones and the bad ones are. We don't know about our internal experience of ourselves. Often we can't tell. We think we can. The servants in this story think they can tell the difference, and think they know what the solution to the problem is, but they can't. And so just as Jesus invites us to love our enemies, part of the promise of that is that enemies can become allies. Enemies can become friends. And I think all of us, I mean, if you're here listening to this, then I'm sure you've experienced the transformational power of love that has turned you and someone you care about has changed their lives. So they become a different person. I mean, that's where we don't want to push this parable too far, is just seeing that weeds are certain people and wheat are certain other people. But that recognizing, and that can never change and can never move, but that in real life and in response to the power of love, people change. That literally happens. And if we're so busy attacking the enemy, we rob them of a chance at transformation, and we rob ourselves at a chance to be transformed. And reminds me of the Chinese proverb of fight the monster and become the monster. That's what happens. If we fight the monster, we become the monster. Jesus refused to become the monster. What needs to be loved here? Who needs to be loved here? I think as we calm our reactive self and let our wise and responsive self emerge, our bodies will tell us. That wisdom about who or what needs to be loved here will be revealed, just as it was revealed to me many years ago. So love yourself, love your neighbors, love your enemies, because that's how Jesus loves. That's how God loves. Be patient. Let God solve the problem. All right. Take care, you guys. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.